Slide 1. Title: Salt versus Sugar and Blood Pressure. A Critical Evidence Audit. For this presentation, I am not treating the video as completely false. Instead, I am treating it as a persuasive but overconfident health argument that mixes valid physiology with exaggerated conclusions. My central position is that the video correctly warns viewers about ultra-processed diets, but it turns a complex clinical issue into a simplified salt versus sugar story. I will examine the claims through peer-reviewed evidence, especially randomized trials, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses, rather than relying on mechanism alone. The key question I'm asking is not whether sugar can influence blood pressure, because it can, but whether the video proves that sugar is the hidden master cause and that salt advice has largely failed. My conclusion is that the evidence does not support that level of certainty. Slide 2. Verdict. The problem is not one ingredient. My overall verdict is that the video is partially correct, but scientifically overstated. Sodium can raise blood pressure, and reducing sodium lowers blood pressure in many people, especially in controlled feeding and crossover trials. Sugar-sweetened beverages are also associated with higher hypertension risk, but that evidence is often observational and cannot fully separate sugar from total calories, body weight, diet quality, socioeconomic factors, and other lifestyle exposures. The video becomes misleading when it suggests that salt advice has failed for most people, or that sugar is the dominant hidden cause across the population. I would frame the issue differently. Hypertension is usually a multi-factor disease involving sodium, adiposity, insulin resistance, kidney function, vascular aging, sleep, alcohol, genetics, and medication adherence. Slide 3. Physiology. Check. Blood pressure is a system, not a slogan. Here I want to correct the physiological framing. The video is right that blood pressure depends on heart output, blood volume, and vascular resistance, but it presents these components too neatly, as though one dietary factor can explain most of the system. A more clinically accurate model is that mean arterial pressure is shaped by cardiac output and total peripheral resistance, while blood volume influences the system upstream through kidney sodium and water handling. Sodium affects plasma volume. Insulin and sympathetic activity can affect renal handling and vascular tone. Aging affects arterial stiffness. Sleep apnea activates sympathetic pathways. Kidney disease disrupts sodium excretion. Therefore, any claim that one ingredient is the main hidden driver should be treated cautiously unless supported by strong clinical outcome evidence. Slide 4. Claim. Test 1. Salt reduction has not worked for most people. On this slide, I directly challenge one of the video's strongest claims, that reducing salt has not worked for most people. Gupta and colleagues, published in JAMA in 2023, used a randomized crossover feeding design in adults aged 50 to 75. Participants consumed high sodium and low sodium diets, and their blood pressure was compared across conditions. This methodology is important because a crossover design allows the same person to act as their own control, reducing between-person variability. The trial found that low sodium reduced systolic blood pressure substantially compared with high sodium, and mean arterial pressure declined in nearly 3/4 of participants. This does not mean everyone is equally salt sensitive, but it does mean that the video's broad dismissal of sodium reduction is not justified. Slide 5. Countercase: people lowered blood pressure without targeting sugar. First, this is a critical countercase because it shows that blood pressure can fall significantly through dietary patterns that include sodium reduction. Sachs and colleagues in the DASH sodium trial, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2001, used a controlled feeding design, which is one of the stronger forms of nutrition evidence because researchers controlled what participants ate. The study compared usual control diets and DASH-style diets across different sodium levels. Blood pressure fell most when the DASH pattern was combined with lower sodium intake, especially among people with higher baseline blood pressure. This directly weakens the video's claim that salt-focused advice is ineffective. The stronger interpretation is that dietary pattern, sodium reduction, potassium intake, and overall food quality interact.
Slide 6. Claim test 2. Sugar-sweetened beverages are a risk signal, not a complete explanation. At this point, I acknowledge that the video is not inventing the sugar concern. Sugar-sweetened beverages are consistently associated with cardiometabolic risk. For example, Jayalath and colleagues conducted a systematic review and dose-response meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies examining sugar-sweetened beverages and hypertension risk. This methodology follows people over time and estimates whether higher intake predicts future disease. The evidence suggests increased hypertension risk with higher intake, but the size of the association is not large enough to justify calling sugar the dominant cause of hypertension in every case. Cohort studies are also vulnerable to residual confounding. People who drink more sugar-sweetened beverages may also have higher total energy intake, lower diet quality, higher obesity risk, more sodium exposure, and different socioeconomic patterns. Slide 7, Claim Test 3. Fructose is not uniformly a blood pressure toxin. This slide is important because the video moves from sugar to fructose and then to uric acid, endothelial dysfunction, and renal sodium retention. Those mechanisms are plausible, but they should not be exaggerated into a universal claim. Liu and colleagues, in controlled feeding, trial meta-analyses on fructose-containing sugars, examined whether fructose affects blood pressure under different feeding conditions. The methodological distinction is essential. When fructose replaces other carbohydrates calorie for calorie, the effect on blood pressure is often small or absent. When fructose adds excess calories, especially through sugar-sweetened beverages, adverse effects become more plausible. This means that fructose cannot be judged outside the food matrix and energy balance. Whole fruit, for example, is not biologically equivalent to sugary drinks because it contains fiber, potassium, water, and phytochemicals. Slide 8. Mechanism audit. Insulin resistance. Matters, but it is not the whole disease. Here I want to separate mechanism from proof. The video's insulin pathway is plausible. Insulin can influence renal sodium retention, sympathetic activity, and vascular function. However, a plausible biological mechanism is not the same as proving that this mechanism explains most hypertension. Hypertension is usually polygenic, renal, vascular, neurohumoral, metabolic, and behavioral at the same time. In some patients, insulin resistance may be a major contributor. In others, kidney disease, vascular aging, high sodium intake, alcohol use, sleep apnea, chronic stress physiology, or medication non-adherence may dominate. My critique is that the video turns one pathway into a master explanation. A more accurate medical argument would present insulin resistance as one important pathway among several. Slide 9. Processed food, a strong suspect, not a magic answer. This is where the video is strongest. Ultra-processed foods are a credible target because they combine several risk factors in one dietary pattern: high sodium, refined carbohydrates, low fiber, low potassium, high energy density, and strong palatability. Vitali and colleagues conducted a systematic review and meta-analysis examining ultra-processed food intake and hypertension risk. This type of evidence is useful for identifying population-level associations, although it still cannot prove that every component has equal causal weight. My position is that processed food is a stronger explanation than either salt alone or sugar alone. However, even this argument must be stated carefully. Saying that processed food matters does not prove that sodium is unimportant or that sugar is the central hidden mechanism. Slide 10. Better frame. Dash explains more than salt or sugar alone. This slide offers the better alternative to the video's framing. The DASH diet does not work because it attacks only one ingredient. It changes the whole dietary environment. More fruits and vegetables, more potassium, more magnesium, more fiber, lower saturated fat, better overall nutrient density, and often lower sodium when combined with sodium reduction. The Saxid-Oliter sodium trial is especially powerful because it used a controlled feeding methodology rather than relying only on self-reported diet. The correct lesson is that blood pressure improves when the total dietary pattern supports vascular and renal regulation. Therefore, the critique should not replace salt is bad with sugar is bad. It should replace both with a pattern-based, evidence-based model. Slide 11. Lifestyle claims, exercise and sleep are evidence-based, but not because of one secret pathway. On this slide, I give the video credit while correcting its certainty. Exercise really does lower blood pressure, and sleep really does matter. Ganja and colleagues, in a meta-analysis of randomized trials, found that aerobic exercise reduces blood pressure, with meaningful effects around guideline-level activity volumes. Randomized exercise trials are stronger than observational evidence because they test an intervention. Hosseini and colleagues, using cohort meta-analysis methods, found that short sleep duration is associated with higher incident hypertension risk, especially at very short sleep durations. However, the video explains these effects too narrowly through nitric oxide and autonomic tone. Those mechanisms are real, but exercise and sleep also influence weight, insulin sensitivity, inflammation, vascular compliance, stress physiology, and medication response. Slide 12. Medications. Do not turn lifestyle critique into medication skepticism. This slide is included for patient safety. The video states that medication controls pressure but does not reverse the disease. That statement can be partly true in a narrow mechanistic sense, but it can also mislead viewers if it makes medication sound superficial. The blood pressure. Lowering treatment. Trialist collaboration published in The Lancet used individual participant-level meta-analysis across randomized trials and found that lowering systolic blood pressure reduces major cardiovascular events. This is high-level evidence because it aggregates trial data and links blood pressure reduction to clinical outcomes. My critique is that lifestyle and medication should not be framed as opponents. Medication reduces risk, while lifestyle can address contributing causes. Many patients need both, especially when stroke, kidney disease, or heart failure risk is high. Slide 13. Argument analysis, where the video becomes hype. Here I shift from medical evidence to argument quality. The video becomes hype through 5 rhetorical moves. First, it creates a false dichotomy between salt and sugar, even though hypertension is multifactorial. Second, it uses mechanistic overreach by treating plausible pathways as though they prove population-level causality. Third, it relies on anecdotal authority from emergency medicine experience, which is valuable clinically but not equivalent to randomized trial evidence. Fourth, it selectively minimizes sodium evidence while emphasizing sugar mechanisms. Fifth, it uses a one-villain structure, where processed food becomes the explanatory endpoint for everything. My main critique is that the video replaces an older oversimplification with a newer oversimplification. Slide 14, YouTube script, a sharper rebuttal for the video. If I were turning this into a YouTube rebuttal, I would say this clearly. The video is useful as a warning against ultra-processed food, but unreliable as a salt versus sugar verdict. First, salt restriction has not failed. Randomized and controlled feeding studies show meaningful blood pressure reductions in many people. Second, sugar-sweetened beverages are associated with hypertension risk, but that evidence does not prove that sugar is the dominant cause for every patient. Third, fructose is not uniformly harmful. Dose, food source, and excess calories matter. Fourth, insulin resistance is a real pathway, not the whole disease. Fifth, processed foods are harmful because they combine sodium, refined carbohydrates, low fiber, low potassium, and excess calories. Sixth, medication should be presented as risk-reducing therapy, not as cosmetic symptom control. Slide 15, final scorecard. Not all wrong, but too certain. My final assessment is that the video is not entirely wrong, but it is too certain in the wrong places. The strongest claims are that sodium reduction can lower blood pressure, exercise can reduce blood pressure, and processed food patterns are associated with hypertension risk. The moderate claims are that sugar-sweetened beverages contribute to hypertension risk, and that ultra-processed diets are harmful at a population level. The weaker claims are that fructose universally raises blood pressure and that insulin resistance explains most hypertension. The best public health message is not ignore salt and blame sugar. The better message is to reduce ultra-processed foods, limit sugar-sweetened beverages, avoid excess sodium when blood pressure is elevated or salt sensitivity is likely, increase potassium-rich whole foods where medically appropriate, exercise regularly, sleep adequately, measure blood pressure properly, and use medication when clinically indicated.